Chapter 4. Virginity. 1. Reason for virginity. A core attribute of monastics is virginity, which is why it is included in the monastic vows for receiving the Great Schema. Footnote: in the tantric service of the Great Schema, the postulant is asked by the abbot, "Will you keep yourself in virginity, chastity, and piety, even unto death?" And the postulant replies, "Yes, God helping me, Reverend Father," from the Great Book of Needs. St. Ambrose of Milan explained the benefit of virginity for those who want to be dedicated to God. Virginity cannot be commanded, but must be wished for things which are above us are matters for prayer rather than under mastery. "But I would have you," St. Paul says, "without cares. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belongeth to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife." There is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I am not indeed discouraging marriage, but am enlarging upon the benefits of virginity. Thus, since virginity leaves a person more free to care for pleasing God, it is natural that people who want to dedicate themselves to God have embraced virginity ever since the beginning of Christianity. Footnote: for example, St. Athenagoras, the philosopher, in the 2nd century wrote, "You would find many among us, both men and women, growing old unmarried, in hope of living in closer communion with God." To continue. St. Ambrose elaborated further on the advantages of virginity from the select works and letters of Ambrosi from the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers. "The days shall come when they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear." Luke 23:29. "For the daughters of this age are conceived, and conceive, but the daughter of the kingdom refrains from wedding pleasure, and the pleasure of the flesh, that she may be holy in body and in spirit. I do not then discourage marriage, but recapitulate the advantages of holy virginity. This is the gift of a few only. This is of all, that is of all. I am comparing good things with good things, that it may be clear which is the more excellent. Nor do I allege any opinion of my own, but I repeat that which the Holy Spirit spake by the prophet. Blessed is the barren that is undefiled." Wisdom 3:13. First of all, in that which those who purpose to marry devise above all things that they may boast of the beauty of their husband, they must of necessity confess that they are inferior to virgins, to whom alone it is suitable to say, "Thou art fairer than the children of men, grace is poured on thy lips." Psalm 44:2. Who is that spouse? One not given to common indulgences, not proud of possessing riches, but he whose throne is forever and ever. Contemporary Orthodox authors have observed marriage is an image of the union of Christ with the Church, whereas monastic life does not constitute an image, but it itself is the mystical marriage of the soul with the heavenly bridegroom. 2. Value of virginity. In the 1st century, St. Clement of Rome pointed out that Christ and the greatest saints were virgins. "It was the Virgin's womb," he wrote, "which bore the Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the body which our Lord put on, in which he accomplished his combat in this world, he took from the Holy Virgin. Know in this the majesty and the glory of virginity. Dost thou wish to be a Christian? Imitate Christ in all things. St. John the Baptist was an angel sent before the face of the Lord, and among them that are born of women there hath not arisen a greater than he. And this holy angel of the Lord was a virgin. Another John, who lay on the breast of the Lord, who loved him greatly, was also holy, which was why the Lord so loved him. Then there were Paul, Barnabas, Timothy, and others whose names are written in the book of life. They all loved this form of holiness and continued in purity to the end of their ascetic lives, thus proving themselves true imitators of Christ and sons of the living God. For those who are like unto Christ are in perfect likeness of him." St. Methodius of Olympus in the early 4th century he wrote about the loftiness of virginity. To quote, "Virginity is supernatural, amazing, and glorious, the most fertile land of the church and its flower. Chastity is a very rare virtue and difficult to achieve. Just as it is so lofty and magnificent, likewise it encounters tremendous dangers. Therefore it requires people with a mighty and a brave character who have completely redirected the urges for pleasure and have directed the chariot of their soul high above. Some who desired this virginity, because they lacked maturity and a desire to struggle, turned back after completing half the journey, since they had not embraced a frame of mind sufficient for the undertaking. For we must not only keep our bodies chaste, but also our souls. What did the Lord, the truth and the light, do when he came down to earth? He kept his flesh without corruption by adorning it with virginity. Therefore we too, if we are to become in the likeness of God, let us honor the virginity of Christ with a sense of honor." St. Methodius, he then went on to quote the passage in Revelation, footnote 685, from Revelation chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. "And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers, harping with their harps. And they sang as it were a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000, which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they were without fault before the throne of God." In the book of Revelation. To continue, St. Methodius then quoted the passage in Revelation about the redeemed 144,000 virgins singing a new song and following the Lamb, and concluded, "This shows that the Lord leads the choir of virgins. Note also that the rank of virgins is great in God's eyes." St. Methodius added that virginity walks on earth, but her head touches the heavens, and is the most brilliant and glorious star of all Christ's charismas. He also said that nothing is superior to chastity in its power to return mankind to paradise. Virginity is the most precious offering and gift, and the greatest vow that a man may make to God. The embrace of virginity is the key way one moves from being God's image to being God's likeness, and quickly causes violent passions to wither away. St. Ambrose also taught that virgins are given a special reward in heaven. To quote, "And so they who have merely fulfilled the commandments are able to say, 'We are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do.'" Luke 17:10. The virgin does not say this, nor he who sold all his goods, but they rather await the stored-up rewards, like the holy apostle who says, "Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore?" Matthew 19:27. He says not, like the unprofitable servant, that he has merely done that which was his duty to do, but as being profitable to his master, because he has multiplied the talents entrusted to him. By the increase he has gained, having a good conscience and without anxiety as to his merits, he expects the reward of his faith and virtue. And so it is said to him and the others, "Ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, shall also yourselves sit upon 12 thrones, judging the tribes of Israel." Matthew 19:28. This great honor given to virgins is the just reward for their great struggle. As St. Theognostus wrote, "There is no greater struggle than the struggle for self-restraint and virginity. He who honors celibacy is admired even by the angels, and is crowned not less than the athletes are. If, bound to flesh and blood, he always strives to imitate through chastity the immaterial nature of the angels, terrible is the battle he has to fight. And if he is successful, so truly great is his achievement that it appears virtually impossible and beyond our nature, Indeed, it would be impossible if God did not help us from above, supporting the weakness of our nature, mending what is rotten, and somehow raising us from the ground through divine eros and through hope for the gifts held in store for us. End of the quote from Philokalia, Volume 2. Likewise, St. Athanasius the Great said, "Ascetical life is burdensome, and abstinence is difficult to bear, but nothing is sweeter than the heavenly bridegroom. Here we toil a little, but there we shall receive eternal life as a reward." St. Sophronia of Essex explained that virginity is supernatural, not contranatural. Quote, "The Church's millennial experience has proved beyond all doubt that preclusion of the sexual function not only causes no psychological nor physical harm, but, on the contrary, when correctly interpreted, increases man's physical endurance, his longevity, and his mental health, while at the same time conducing to his spiritual development. In recent years, numerous scientific works have confirmed the spiritual fruitfulness of what contemporary psychology sometimes terms, quote, sublimation. One can rejoice at this confirmation. Throughout the ages, the celibacy of the monk has never ceased to be distorted and even opposed as a pathological phenomenon of a, quote, going against nature. However, contemporary scientific experience in this field is still too insignificant to be compared with the centuries-old experience of the Church, or to enrich it, so that it does not yet hold much interest for the monks. Leaving aside any detailed examination of the dogmatic and anthropological aspects of the question, let me merely remark that for us, the fundamental and incontestable justification of this vow, to which all the other arguments finally come round, lies in the example given to us by the Lord himself. "I have given you an example," John 13, verse 15. Only a lunatic would venture to say that Christ's life went against nature. From St. Sophrony Sakharov's work, Truth and Life. 3. Angelic nature of virginity. Numerous saints taught that virginity is an angelic way of life that provides a foretaste of the future life in heaven. For example, St. Ambrose wrote, again from his selected works and letters, "And for you, holy virgins, there is a special guardianship, for you who with unspotted chastity keep the couch of the Lord holy. And no wonder if the angels fight for you who war with the mode of life of the angels. Virginal chastity merits their guardianship whose life it attains to. Why should I continue the praise of chastity in more words? For chastity has made even angels. He who has preserved it is an angel. He who has lost it, a devil, and hence has religion also gained its name. She is a virgin who is the bride of God, a harlot who makes gods for herself. What shall I say of the resurrection of which you already hold the rewards? For in the resurrection they will neither be given in marriage nor marry, but shall be, he says, as the angels in heaven. Matthew 22, verse 30. That which is promised to us is already present with you, and the object of your prayers is with you. Ye are of this world, and yet not in this world. This age has held you, but has not been able to retain you. End of quote. St. John of Sinai also compared the virginal life with the angelic life. Purity means that we put on the angelic nature. Purity is the longed-for house of Christ and the earthly heaven of the heart. Purity is a supernatural denial of nature, which means that a mortal and a corruptible body is rivaling the celestial spirits in a truly marvelous way. He is pure who expels fleshly love with divine love, and who has extinguished the fire of passion by the fire of heaven. St. Gregory of Nyssa wrote that virginity is, quote, a kind of art and power of a more divine life that teaches those living in the flesh to imitate the nature of the bodiless angels. St. Leander of Seville in 6th century Spain, he wrote in the monastic rule, quote, a virgin may marry, but she who does not is numbered among the angels. Do you see, dearly beloved sister, how virgins hold the chief place in the kingdom of God? and not undeservedly, for they had contempt for the world's vanity and thereby reached the heavenly kingdom. The early Desert Fathers shared this same understanding of the angelic nature of monasticism. Abba Anub mentioned that he saw the lifestyle of monks as a most holy way of life equal to the angels. Abba Hyperchios wrote, "A dispassionate monk who has not been wounded by the arrows of pleasure is an earthly imitator of the angels." St. Serpion said, "Know, O monastics, most honorable to God, how many misfortunes Christ has freed for you. Know how many disasters you have avoided. Know what kind of life you are living, for your way of life is equal to the angels. For just as in the resurrection of the dead, the righteous neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as angels in heaven, in the same way you, by living together in this manner, eagerly anticipate what is to come. Who then would not call you blessed for having chosen a care-free way of life? Who would not embrace your mode of life in the deserts? Who would not desire your stillness?" End of quote. Numerous other saints supported this view of angelic monasticism. St. Basil the Great wrote, "These monks have imitated the life of the angels, for they, like the angels, have kept a common life with exactitude. Among the angels there is no quarreling or disputes or arguments. Everything belongs to each of them." St. John Chrysostom taught, "Tell me, how did Elias and Elisha and John the Baptist, those true lovers of virginity, differ from the angels? In no way, other than by being bound to mortal nature. In other ways, if one were to examine carefully, one would find them not at all inferior to the angels. That it was virginity that made them great is evident from this. If they had a wife and children, they would not have easily dwelt in the desert. They would not have despised houses and other objects in this life. But as it was, they were free of these bonds and lived on earth as if they were beings in the heavens." Elsewhere, St. John Chrysostom added, "They should put her, that is, the Virgin of Christ, in the marketplace as a statue of philosophy for all to see and be amazed as if beholding an angel who has just now descended from heaven." St. Athanasius the Great exclaimed, "O continents, the life of the angels and the crown of holy men." St. Isidore of Pelusium wrote, "We think that merely having a tattered cloak and a beard and a staff is sufficient for us to live the angelic way of life." St. Ephrem the Syrian said, "Beloved brethren, since we wear the angelic schema, let us not fight on the devil's side, but let us aspire as far as possible to the life of the angels. For the habit must be accompanied by a way of life and by deeds. Without deeds, the schema is of no value. Do the angels perchance dwell in heaven amid quarreling and jealousy, as we see happening nowadays among monks?" St. Isaac the Syrian wrote, "The angels continually visited these men, that is, the anchorites, because their modes of life were so similar. And as being troops of a single sovereign, at all times they kept company with their comrades in arms, that is to say, those who embraced the desert all the days of their life, and took up their abode in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth, because of their love for God." See more of the ascetical homilies of St. Isaac the Syrian, page 158. St. Simeon of Thessaloniki explained, "The monastic schema is called angelic, and is indeed so, since it promises to imitate the angels' chastity, non-possessiveness, hymns, prayers, obedience, and purity. How is the schema of repentance also called angelic? Someone might say that it is because angels do not fall, and neither is it in their nature to fall. Let such a person hear that God alone is unchanging and unable to fall, as he ever is and remains unchangeable. As for those who are created, they're subject to change. This is evident since some of the angels have fallen. But to be an angel means being careful, humbling oneself, obeying God, being a clean minister, and doing his will as it is written, Psalm 102:19. Therefore a monk likewise, although having fallen human nature, has the power and eagerness to trample upon all the might of the enemy, and nothing shall in no wise harm him. Thus he departs from the worldly life, and by leaving parents and wife and children and siblings, he imitates the life of the angels. He becomes detached from mundane things below and has no relatives in the flesh, and is not accountable to them. But he takes up the cross of Christ on his shoulders, following in his footsteps, is obedient and denies all things without doing his own will. This is the work of the angels. 4. Duration of virginity. A person who becomes a monk is obliged to remain a monk for the rest of his life. According to St. Basil, a virgin and a nun is to be regarded as the bride of Christ and a chosen vessel dedicated to the Lord. And therefore he says that if she breaks her vow, she is to be punished as though convicted of adultery. St. Basil adds that this principle is extended to men also. Similarly, St. John Chrysostom wrote to monk Theodore, who was considering marriage, "It is no longer possible for thee to observe the right conditions of marriage. For if he who has been attached to a heavenly bridegroom deserts him and joins himself to a wife, the act is adultery, even if you call it marriage 10,000 times over. Or rather, it is worse than adultery in proportion as God is greater than man." St. John Chrysostom on the Priesthood Ascetic Treatise. A similar understanding was prevalent also in early Egyptian monasticism, as is evident from the incident of a monk whom St. Pachomius saved from being estranged from God by leaving the schema. St. Benedict dedicated that a monk should put his vow in writing. Quote, "Let him who is received into the brotherhood promise in the oratory, in the presence of all, before God and his saints, stability, the conversion of morals, and obedience, in order that if he should ever do otherwise, he may know that he will be condemned by God, whom he mocketh. Let him make a written statement of his promise in the name of the saints, whose relics are there, and of the abbot there present. Let him write this document with his own hand, and with his own hand place it on the altar. If on the devil's suasion he should ever consent to leave the monastery, which God forbid, he should then stripped of his monastic habit and be cast out. But let him not receive the document of his profession which the abbot took from the altar, but let it be preserved in the monastery." End of the quote from the Rule of St. Benedict. To continue, commenting on this, Evgenia Zhukova wrote in a dissertation entitled "The Origin and Evolution of the Service of the Monastic Schema." Quote, "In this manner it is shown that the monk's vow is made to God himself, so that even if he leaves the monastery, his vow remains in force, since whatever is dedicated to God can no longer fall away from its current state to its former state." The fathers in the early days of Egyptian monasticism had the same understanding, for when a monk was expelled after failing to comply to repeated admonitions, the fathers would remove his monastic clothing before expelling him. This, however, did not indicate that he had lost his monastic identity. The Fourth Ecumenical Council stated, "If any virgin has dedicated herself to the Lord God, or any men likewise have become monks, let them not be permitted to engage in marriage." Agapius and Nicodemus the Rudder. But since this was written in 451 AD, before the practice of making Rossophoir monks was established in the 12th century, some people have argued that this rule applies only to great schema monks, since great schema monks make explicit vows, whereas Rossophoir monks do not. For example, in 1906, Bishop Nicodemus Milas, a professor of canon law, reasoned that a Rossophoir monk may marry in his influential book, Ecclesiastical Law of the Eastern Orthodox Church. More recently, in 2005, Archimandrite Hieronymus Nikolopoulos reached the same conclusion in his study entitled Regarding Rossophoir Monks. Likewise, the doctoral thesis of Stefanio Drew in 2008, entitled The Great and Angelic Schema as a Second Baptism, it presents the historical background of the evolution of the Rossophoir, and then, based on a comparison of the prayers read for a Rossophoir and for the small schema, concludes that a Rossophoir does not have a monastic identity. Convincing rebuttals of these views, however, may be found in the article regarding the value which the holy service for a beginner becoming a Rossifor has in the Church, written by Abbot Tikhon of Stravnonikita Monastery. Another rebuttal may be found in the article by an Athonite monk, entitled The Service for a Beginner Becoming a Rossifor, or To What Degree a Person Who Has Undergone the Service for a Beginner Becoming a Rossifor Partakes of Monastic Identity. Generally speaking, most Athonites view a Rossifor as having all the obligations of a monk, whereas a number of people in the Church of Greece view a Rossifor as having only the obligations of a novice. The first objections to the opinion that Rossifors may leave monasticism were made in the 12th century by Patriarch Theodore Balsamon, a well-respected canonist, and St. Eustathios of Thessaloniki, who wrote regarding Rossifors, "Do you not know, O beginner monk, that you too, after your official, though subtle and unspoken, tonsure were immediately dedicated to God? At your enrollment to serve in monasticism, witnesses were present whom I must mention. Angels are holding in their hands the contract of your servitude. Do not think that the divine mystery of your dedication is not known to God and his angels. The rank you have is great, O beginner monk. You've already been enrolled to serve the king. Woe then to whoever tries to separate you from this service and lead you away. And who would do this other than Satan, the prince of darkness? But he will be unable to do so if you hold tightly to God. But in order to understand that a person like you can no longer be a layman, try taking off your holy clothes. You will find out through experience that in the world you're unable to accomplish any of the things provided for by your monastic identity, even if you make 10,000 attempts. For there is no one at all who would dare to detach from God someone like you who is dedicated to God without being anathematized." End quote. Likewise, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain in the Rudder in the footnote to Canon 43 of the Sixth Ecumenical Council emphatically stated that Rossifor monks may not marry because one hair was cut from their head. Footnote 729. Although St. Nicodemus includes the cutting of the hair of one of the reasons why a Rossifor monk may not marry, the service for making Rossifor monks does not explicitly state whether or not hair should be cut, that is, tonsured. Because it is not explicitly mentioned in recent editions of the Eulokion, some abbots do not cut the hair when making Rossifor monks, while others do. In the late 20th century, however, the Holy Community of the Holy Mountain decided that the hair of novices should be cut when they're made Rossifor monks, so that they may become more fully aware that they're being tonsured and therefore cannot subsequently marry. To continue the text, 1. Because hair was cut from their head, which denotes their consecration to God. 2. They have worn the raso. 3. They wear the scufo, a monastic hat. 4. They have changed their name. And 5. They have had 2 special prayers read over them that thank God for bringing them to the monastic life. To quote St. Nicodemus in full, footnote 730. It is plain that all those who arrive at the point of being Rossifors, that is, of having donned the rason, or monastic habit, or the black garb affected by monks in general, can no longer throw aside their ransom and marry. God forbid, for how could they possibly dare to do this at a time when they have already cut off the hair of their head, a fact which denotes that they have rejected from their head any and every worldly concern and have consecrated their life to God? How could that be possible when in point of fact they have even donned the rason with a blessing and have put on the monastic hat and have changed their name, and 2 special prayers have already been read to them by the priest in which he thanks God for having redeemed them from the vain and worldly life and having called them to the decent and modest profession of monks, and begs him to accept and welcome them into his soterial yoke? Again we ask, if one who has merely promised to become a monk, without so much as having donned the rason or monk's habit, ought not to break, but on the contrary ought to carry out his promise, in accordance with the scriptural passage saying, "Thou shalt perform thy vows to the Lord," how much more is it not incumbent upon one to do so after he has actually put on the rason? That is the reason that Balsamam says that a person who has put on the rason is not permitted thereafter to become a layman, but on the contrary, he will be, for this, compelled to carry out his earlier aim. If he is unwilling to do this, says Balsamam, he is to be punished severely. To continue. Commenting on the service of Arasifor, Evgenia Zhukovo wrote, "This service reminds us very much of the ancient forms of receiving a candidate we found in the lives of the saints. It is brief. The vow is silent. Since the catechism and its acceptance preceded the service, which is evident from the rubrics of this service, prescribed in Slavonic versions, we would even say that this service, which is done until today, is the oldest form of the service of the great in terms of its meaning and angelic schema. In written sources regarding the saints until the 7th century, we can see the singular nature of the monastic schema, which consists of different items depending on the location and the era. The notion of a great schema or a great schema monk did not exist. From the moment one has renounced the world and has worn the ascetical, monastic, canonical, holy, angelic schema, that is, any garments that indicate a renunciation of the world and render one a monk in the eyes of the world, regardless of the place, whether in a brotherhood, whether in the desert or in a house, one is considered an ascetic and a monk. I believe that if we today are to be faithful to the monastic tradition, no one would dare to consider Arasifor as not being a monk, or as not being a complete monk who has the right to remove his schema, that is, his garments, and return to the world. End of quote. To conclude this section, the canon law professor P.I. Panagiotakos wrote, "The contrary opinion formulated now and then, which leads to the unacceptable conclusion that a Arasifor monk has the right to abandon ascesis whenever he wants and to return to the world and to marry without an impediment, as if he has not vowed to keep the sacred promise of virginity, is not only unsound and mistaken, but altogether unsupportable legally and canonically. It fatally wounds the canonical order of the Church, and it slights the prevailing exactitude toward the canons regarding this matter from the foundation. Besides, the ancient tradition in monastic life applied to this matter has firmly established and applied this acrivia, this exactitude to canon, which it continues to apply unaltered until today." 5. Superiority of celibacy to marriage. Countless saints throughout the centuries have expressed the opinion that the path of celibacy is superior to the path of marriage. St. Athanasius the Great taught, quote, "There are two ways of life as touching these matters. The one, the more moderate and ordinary, marriage. The other, angelic and unsurpassed, namely virginity. Now if a man choose the way of the world, namely marriage, he is not indeed to blame. Yet he will not receive such great gifts as the other, for he will receive, since he too brings forth fruit, namely 30-fold. See Mark 4, verse 20. But if a man embrace the holy and unearthly way, even though as compared with the former it be rugged and hard to accomplish, yet it has the more wonderful gifts, for it grows the perfect fruit, namely 100-fold. Footnote 733. Athanasius' Selected Works and Letters. Similarly, St. Jerome taught, the yield 30-fold signifies wedlock, the yield 60-fold refers to widows who are placed in a position of distress and tribulation. Moreover, 100 indicates the crown of virginity. These quotes suggest that the early church fathers understood the words of Christ in Matthew chapter 19, verse 29, as referring to the reward for monastic virginity. Quote, "And everyone that hath forsaken houses, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life." To continue. St. Gregory the theologian said, "It is better to be free of these bonds of marriage, rendering everything to God and to the things above. marriage is concern about spouse and loved ones, whereas for virginity, it is Christ. It so surpasses marriage and the fetters of the world, even as the soul is apt to be more excellent than the flesh, and the wide heaven than the earth, as the stable life of the blessed is more excellent than transitory life, as God is superior to man. These virgins are the lights of the world, bright mirrors of the light. They see God, are seen by God, and belong to God. Gregor the theologian. St. John Chrysostom agreed. Is virginity a good thing? Yes, I fully agree. But is it better than marriage? I agree with this too. Virginity is as much superior to marriage as heaven is to earth, as the angels are to men. And to use far stronger language, it is more superior still. For the angels, though they do not marry and are not given in marriage, are not a mixture of flesh and blood. They do not pass time on earth and endure trouble from passions. But mankind, inferior in its nature to blessed spirits, forces its own nature, and insofar as it can, vies eagerly to equal the angels. Do you grasp the value of virginity? That it makes those who spend time on earth live like the angels dwelling in heaven. It does not allow those endowed with bodies to be inferior to the incorporeal powers, and spurs all men to rival the angels. What then does Paul say under the inspiration of the Lord? Now for the matters you wrote about, a man is better off having no relations with woman, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. Footnote John Chrysostom on virginity against remarriage. So do not prefer over virginity that which was admitted because of your weakness. Rather, do not even put them on the same level. To continue. In the same vein, St. Jerome wrote, I praise wedlock, I praise marriage, but it is because they give me virgins. I gather the rose from the thorns, the gold from the earth, the pearl from the shell. Concerning virgins, says the Apostle Paul, I have no commandment of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 7:25. Why was this? Because his own virginity was due not to a command, but to his free choice. What is freely offered is worth more than what is extorted by force. When he is discussing continence and commending perpetual chastity, he uses the words, I would that all men were even as I myself. And farther on, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them to, if they abide even as I. Footnote 737 on 1 Corinthians 7:8. Similarly, the 2nd century shepherd of Hermas wrote, there is no sin in marrying again, but if they remain unmarried, they gain greater honor and glory with the Lord, from the shepherd of Hermas. To continue, St. Ambrose also cited St. Paul to show the superiority of virginity. Quote, marriage then is honorable, but chastity is more honorable, for he that giveth his virgin in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. 1 Corinthians 8:28. That then which is good need not be avoided, but that which is better should be chosen. St. Clement wrote, he will give to virgins a notable place in the house of God, better than the place of those who have passed a wedded life in sanctity and whose bed has not been defiled. Hebrews 13:4. St. John Chrysostom said, even though marriage be honorable, Hebrews 13:4, yet it can only go so far as not to defile those who engage in it. But to produce saints is not within the power of marriage, but of virginity. Developing this concept, St. John of the Ladder wrote, who amongst laymen has ever worked any miracles? Who has raised the dead? Who has driven out devils? No one. All these are the victorious rewards of monks, rewards which the world cannot receive. And if it could, then what is the need of asceticism or solitude? St. Barsanuphius the Great added to this. Truly blessedness can only be acquired in a monastery. You can be saved in the world, but it is impossible to be completely purified, or to rise up and live like the angels and live a creative spiritual life in the world. All the ways of the world destroy or at least slow down the development of the soul. and that's why people can attain the angelic life only in monasteries. Monasticism is blessedness, the most blessed state that is possible for a person on this earth. There's nothing higher than this blessedness, because monasticism hands you the key to spiritual life. In the same spirit, Geranda Fram of Philotheu in Arizona observed, the supernatural miracles of monastics and their spiritual state, the fruit of their ascetical struggles, show what monasticism is. Struggling to live the Christian life in the world is indeed a godly pursuit, but it does not even come close to the spiritual wealth and closeness to God produced by monasticism. A tree is known by its fruit. Matthew 12:33. A whole army of monastics have filled heaven. How many righteous saints, those who were not monastics, clergy, or martyrs, do we have? You can count them on your fingers. End of quote from a homily given at the holy monastery Philotheu. And St. Simeon of Thessaloniki stated, there are many paths to salvation, but monasticism is the most perfect path. St. John of the Damascene wrote, virginity is the angelic way of life and the characteristic of every bodiless nature. As much as an angel is superior to man, by the same amount is virginity more honorable than marriage. What am I talking about angels for? Christ himself, the boast of virginity, not only was born from the Father without beginning, change, or conjugal union, but also he became man like us for our sake by taking on flesh from the Virgin without union. And he demonstrated the true and complete virginity in himself. Marriage is good for those who lack continence, but virginity is better because it increases the soul's fertility and offers prayer to God as a ripe fruit. Several saints in the 4th century viewed monastics as soldiers of Christ, including Saint Serpion of Themius, who wrote, blessed are you monks who serve as soldiers to the Trinity in one essence. St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great taught that monastics enjoy greater honor than laymen, just as soldiers of a king deserve more honor than civilians. To quote, the Golden Mouth writes, a king's edicts addressed to his subjects are solemn enough, but greater and more regal are his orders to his soldiers. As if military orders are being proclaimed, therefore, let that man give ear who desires what is of greater and celestial worth, who wishes to be ever Christ's comrade. A soldier has rations from the king. He need not get rations for himself, nor concern himself in this regard. Everywhere the houses of the subjects are open to him by the king's command. He need not trouble about a house. His tent is pitched in the streets, bare necessities are his food, water is his drink, and his sleep is what nature gives and no more. Many are his marches and vigils. He contends against heat, against cold. He fights the foe and faces extreme dangers, and often it may be death. But a glorious death, and honors and royal gifts are his lot. His life is a laborious, in war, splendid, in peace. The prize of valor and the crown awarded to one whose life is a successful record of good actions is to be entrusted with rule, to be called the king's friend, to stand near the king, to be the foremost among his subjects, to plead on behalf of his friends outside for whatever they desire. Come then, O soldier of Christ, take to heart these small lessons from human affairs and bear in mind the eternal blessings. Set before yourself a life without house, city, or possessions. Be free, released from all worldly cares, lest you be fettered by the desire for a woman or by cares for a child. But you who love the heavenly way of living and practice the angelic life and desire to become a fellow soldier of Christ's holy disciples, brace yourself to endure afflictions and come manfully to the assembly of the monks. End of quote. In his book, The Clothing of Virgins, St. Cyprian of Carthage, speaking of the dignity of the virginal state, says, virgins are the flowering buds of the church, the glory and ornament of spiritual grace, a work of praise and honor, whole and uncorrupted. the image of God corresponding to the holiness of the Lord, the most illustrious member of Christ's flock. And the more there aboundeth virginity, the greater the increase of joy in the mother. St. Gregory Palamas taught that the overcoming passions and attaining salvation is easier for those living in virginity. To quote from his Palamas treatise on the spiritual life, this cleansing from the passions can also be accomplished by those who live in marriage, but with utmost difficulty. For this reason, everyone who from their youth has found favor in God's sight perceives eternal life through the penetrating eye of the mind, and in fact falls in love with that eternal goodness and duly flees marriage. Paul addresses those who are married. The appointed time is short, and that from now on let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. 1 Corinthians 7:29 and following. Palamas continues, I personally consider married life to be more difficult than the labors of virginity. Experience testifies that fasting is easier than the moderation of eating and drinking. I will speak rightly and truly. To one who is not interested in being saved, I have nothing to say, but to one who is concerned with one's own salvation, let this one know life in virginity is more beneficial and much easier than married life. One fact is certain. When gold is mixed with copper, then it is called fool's gold. But when copper is gold-plated, then it appears more exquisite than it is and is much more brilliant. Thus it is with you, O virgin. When one of the married women yearns for you in your virginal life, this offers her glory. However, when you begin to yearn for that which is theirs, you bring disgrace upon yourself, for this desire returns you back once again to the world. End of quote of Palamas. After enumerating the difficulties of married life, St. Serpion of Thimus wrote enthusiastically about the delights of monastic virginity. Quote, but you abide in the wilderness free from cares, attending only to your luminous life. Oh, how much superiority and honor your holy and sacred schema has. Oh, how much spiritual fragrance it emits. Oh, what a marvelous lifestyle you have chosen. No words can sing its praises. Oh, what a profession that touches heaven. Oh, what a profession that unites you with God. Oh, what a profession that portrays the angels. Oh, what a profession that preserves being in the image of God. Oh, what a profession that stands beside God. Oh, what a profession most honorable to God. Oh, what a profession by which the world is saved. It would be a mistake to think that the Holy Fathers viewed virginity as superior to marriage merely because they themselves were all celibate and therefore biased. For even St. Gregory of Nyssa wrote, the more exactly we understand the riches of virginity, the more we must bewail the other married life. For we realize by this contrast with better things how poor it is. I do not speak only of the future reward in store for those who have lived thus excellently, but those rewards also which they have while alive here. For if anyone would make up his mind to measure exactly the difference between the two courses, he would find it well nigh as great as that between heaven and earth. Notwithstanding this patristic opinion that celibacy is superior to marriage, this does not mean that it is God's will for everyone to remain celibate. Many ostensibly superior monastics have lost their salvation, while many supposedly inferior laymen have been saved. Celibacy is a particular calling that God has given only to a few people. For when the apostles concluded, it is not good to marry, Christ replied, not everyone can receive this saying, but only to those whom it is given. Commenting on this passage, St. John Chrysostom said, what then saith Christ? He said not, yea, it is easier not to marry, and so do, lest they should suppose that the thing is a law. But he subjoined, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given, raising the thing and showing that it is great, and in this way drawing them on and urging them. But see herein a contradiction, for he indeed saith, this is a great thing, but they, that it is easier. For it was meet that both these things should be done, and that it should be at once acknowledged a great thing by him, that it might render them more forward, and by the things said by themselves it should be shown to be easier, that on this ground, too, they might the rather choose virginity and continence. For since we speak of virginity seem to be grievous, by the constraint of this law he drove them to this desire. Likewise, St. Cyprian of Carthage made the following comments on that scriptural passage. Nor does the Lord command this, that is virginity, but he exhorts it. Nor does he impose the yoke of necessity, since the free choice of the will is left. But when he says that in his Father's house are many mansions, he points out the dwellings of a better habitation. Moreover, the whole point of comparing the two paths is not to enable those who are supposedly, quote, superior to gloat pridefully over those who are, quote, inferior. As St. John of Sinai warns us, quote, it is possible to belittle those living in the world out of conceit. It is also possible to disparage them behind their backs in order to avoid despair and to obtain hope. But rather to encourage those who are free to choose between the two paths to follow the one that is likely to produce superior results for him or her personally. Since the manner in which a person lives his life is more important than which mode of life he has chosen, St. Simeon the New Theologian said, many regard the monastic life as the most blessed way. For my part, however, I would not set any way above the others, nor would I praise one and depreciate another. But in every situation, it is the life lived for God and according to God that is entirely blessed. 6. Inferiority of virginity. Another point worth pondering is that since married life is more difficult, perhaps it would not be unreasonable to deduce that it also has a greater reward when successfully lived in a God-pleasing manner. Metropolitan Callistos Ware wrote in his introduction to the latter, quote, it is a great thing, says John, to achieve stillness in the isolation of a hermit's cell, but it is incomparably greater to have no fear of turmoil and to remain steadfast under its assault with a fearless heart, living outwardly with men but inwardly with God. End of quote. Just as attaining Hezekiah is a greater feat for someone living in the world than for someone living in a hermitage, by extension one could also surmise that attaining chastity, which entails not merely continence, but a transformation of carnal desire into eros for God. Footnote 761. According to Orthodox theology, the passible faculties, that is, the faculties of the soul subject to passion, which are the insensitive power and the appetitive aspect, are God-given and therefore do not need to be suppressed, but rather should be used as God intended. St. Basil the Great wrote, by the way it is used, each of the other faculties also becomes either evil or good for the one who possesses it. As for the soul's faculty of desire, one who uses it for the enjoyment of the flesh and the consumption of impure pleasure is disgusting and licentious, while one who turns it toward the love of God and the longing for eternal good things is enviable and blessed. St. Maximus the Confessor said, even passions become good if we wisely and diligently detach them from what is bodily and direct them toward the acquisition of what is heavenly. This happens, for example, when we turn desire into a noetic yearning for heavenly blessings. He also taught, when a man's nous is constantly with God, his desire grows beyond all measure into an intense longing for God. When it, that is the nous, has reintegrated its passible aspect, it redirects this aspect toward God, as we've said, filling it with an incomprehensible and intense longing for him. Similarly, St. Gregory Palamas wrote to Barlaam, we have not been taught that dispassion is putting to death of the soul's passionate part. On the contrary, it is the conversion of the passionate part from the lower to the higher. Likewise, the Athonite Fathers wrote, once the soul's passible aspect is transformed and sanctified, but not reduced to a death-like condition, through it, the dispositions and activities of the body are also sanctified, since body and soul share a conjoint existence. From the declaration of the holy mountain in defense of those who devoutly practice a life of stillness. As for Eros, St. Maximus the Confessor taught, God is the producer and generator of love and Eros. Insofar as the Eros originates from him, he can be said to be the moving force of it, since he generated it. St. John Chrysostom said about Eros and marriage, "This is not something human, but it is God who sows these loves." St. Gregory of Nyssa showed that Eros can be either shamefully directed to the flesh or praiseworthily directed to the immaterial bridegroom. For he wrote, "Intensified love is called Eros, in which no one is put to shame when he does not aim it at the flesh, but rather he takes pride in the wound when he receives the point of immaterial desire in the depths of his heart." In the same vein, St. Gregory Palamas said, "When desire is redirected from the flesh to the spirit, it raises us to such heights." And Archimandrite Zacharias taught that a monk living in virginity transforms every energy into a spiritual force, so as to keep his spirit in constant association with the Spirit of God. A life of spiritual virginity is an exalted art and culture, whose fundamental value lies in the guarding of the nous. To continue. But a transformation of carnal desire into Eros for God is a greater feat for someone married than for someone celibate, even though this does not mean that a person seeking chastity should choose marriage any more than a person seeking Hezekiah and stillness should remain in the world. St. Cyprian of Carthage agreed with this reasoning. He wrote, "Assuredly, to have guarded one's purity from the womb and to have kept oneself an infant even to old age throughout the whole of life is certainly the part of an admirable virtue. Only that if never to have known the body's seductive capacities is the greater blessedness, to have overcome them when once known is the greater virtue." Clement of Alexandria wrote more boldly, quote, "True manhood is shown not in the choice of a celibate life. On the contrary, the prize in the contest of men is won by him who has trained himself by the discharge of the duties of husband and father, and by the supervision of a household, regardless of pleasure or pain. By him, I say, who in the midst of his solicitude for his family shows himself inseparably from the love of God and rises superior to every temptation which assails him through children and through wife and servants and possessions. On the other hand, he who has no family is in most respects untried. In any case, as he takes thought only for himself, he is surpassed by him who is inferior, as far as his own personal salvation is concerned, but who is superior in the conduct of life, inasmuch as he actually preserves a faint image of the true providence. One could argue that even St. John of Sinai would also agree with this reasoning, for he warns monks, "Be on the lookout for this trick and the wile of the thieves, that is, the demons. For they suggest to us that we need not separate ourselves from people in the world, and maintain that we shall receive a great reward if we can look upon women and still remain continent. We must not believe these suggestions, but rather do the opposite." The fact that St. John does not try to disprove this suggestion of the demons, but simply advises monks not to pay attention to it, seems to imply that he believes that it is indeed a greater feat to remain completely chaste in the presence of women than to do the same in their absence. But he discourages us from attempting this because there is a high probability of failure. St. John Chrysostom, however, explained that the greater difficulty of the married life does not merit greater reward. He wrote that married Christians, quote, "must expend greater effort if they wish to be saved, because of the constant constraint imposed on them. For the person who is free of bonds will run more easily than the one who is enchained. Will the latter then receive a greater reward and the more glorious crown? Not at all. For he placed this constraint upon himself when he was free not to." In conclusion, these patristic statements seem to imply that celibacy is not ipso facto superior to marriage, but its superior lies in the practical reality that it is more likely to be conducive to spiritual growth, or increase the fertility of the soul, as St. John of Damascene put it. Marriage is good for those lacking in self-control, but better is virginity, which increases the fertility of the soul. 7. Virginity of Soul. Christ taught that true chastity is not just external but internal. Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Matthew 5:28. Elaborating on this precept, the Holy Fathers taught that virginity that is merely external is insufficient. For example, the Blessed Augustine wrote in his monastic rule, quote, "Although your eyes may chance to rest upon some woman or other, you must not fix your gaze upon any woman. Seeing women when you go out is not forbidden, but it is sinful to desire them or to wish them to desire you. For it is not by tough or passionate feeling alone, but by one's gaze also that lustful desires mutually arise. Do not say that your hearts are pure if there is immodesty of the eye, because the unchaste eye carries the message of an impure heart. And when such hearts disclose their unchaste desires in a mutual gaze, even without saying a word, then it is that chastity suddenly goes out of their life, even though their bodies remain unsullied by unchaste acts. And whoever fixes his gaze upon a woman and likes to have hers fixed upon him must not suppose that others do not see what he is doing. He is very much seen, even by those he thinks do not see him. But suppose all this escapes the notice of man, what will he do about God, who sees from on high and from whom nothing is hidden? So, when you're together in church and anywhere else where women are present, exercise a mutual care over purity of life." Likewise, St. Columbanus wrote in his monastic rule, "Oh, what value it is if the monk is a virgin in body, but not in mind. For God, being spirit, lives in that spirit and in that mind which seems to him undefiled, in which there is no adulterous thought, no stain of a polluted spirit, and no spot of sin." St. Gregory Palamas said that virginity is keeping thoughts from consenting to any evil. And St. Isaac the Syrian taught, "A virgin is not merely one who keeps his body undefiled by intercourse, but one who feels shame before himself even when he is alone." St. John Cassian wrote, "Some strong words of St. Basil, the Bishop of Caesarea, are apropos. He said, 'I do not know woman, but I am not a virgin.'" Well, indeed, did he understand that the incorruption of the flesh consists not so much in abstaining from women as it does in integrity of heart, which ever and truly preserves the incorrupt holiness of the body by both the fear of God and the love of chastity. Furthermore, St. Basil the Great taught that not only carnal thoughts sully a monk's virginity, but all the passions do. To quote, "Virginity is a help to such devotion for those who pursue this gift of being in the likeness of God in a spiritual manner. For merely abstaining from the procreation of children does not constitute the gift of virginity. On the contrary, the whole of one's life and character must be virginal, illustrating in every action the integrity required of the virgin. For it is possible to commit fornication in speech and adultery with the eye, to be polluted through the hearing, to receive defilement in the heart, and to transgress the bounds of temperance by lacking control in partaking of the food and drink. Anger, jealousy, bearing a grudge, falsehood, insolence, arrogance, unseasonable talking, slackness in prayer, desire for goods one does not possess, negligence in observing the commandments, ostentation in dress, vain regard for one's appearance, meetings and conversations beyond what is necessary and fitting, all these must be carefully avoided by one who has dedicated himself to God by virginity, because yielding to one of them is almost as perilous as committing an expressly forbidden sin." St. Joseph the Hesychist taught that chastity makes a person fragrant. From monastic wisdom from the letters of St. Joseph the Hesychist. When a person fights to keep his body pure and his mind chaste from dirty thoughts, his life and his prayer ascend like fragrant incense to the heavens. I have seen in practice what I'm telling you. No sacrifice to God is more fragrant than chastity of the body, which is obtained with a bloody and dreadful struggle. I have much to say about this blessed chastity, the fruit of which I have tasted and eaten. But you are not able to bear right now what I would say. Only one thing will I tell you. When such people change their underclothes, which they might do only once every 3 or 6 months, they give off a fragrance that fills the entire house, as if a refreshing vial of myrrh had been opened. This is a sign from God of their blessed chastity and most holy virginity." End of quote. Saint Sophronia of Essex wrote, "Chastity, as the word itself shows, signifies integrity or fullness of wisdom. In the Church, the concept embodies not only mastery over sexual impulses or the complex of the flesh in general, and in this sense victory over nature, but the acquisition of the combination of perfections proper to wisdom, which will be expressed by a constant dwelling in God with all one's mind, with all one's heart. In its most complete realization, the ascetic feat of chastity may restore man in the spirit to his virginal state. St. John of Sinai warned that some dangerous behaviors can seem deceptively innocent because they do not give rise to a temptation immediately. Quote from the Ladder of Divine Ascent, "I have seen some give way to luxury and not at once feel the attacks of the enemy. I have seen others eat with women and converse with them, and at the time have no bad thoughts whatsoever in their mind. They were thus deceived and encouraged to grow careless and to think that they were in peace and safety, and then suddenly suffered destruction in their cells. But what bodily and spiritual destruction comes to us when we are alone? He who is tempted knows, and he who is not tempted does not need to know." End of quote. Elaborating on this, St. Sophronia of Essex wrote, taken from the book Truth and Life, "As well as the sexual act, there are not a few other forms of depravity and self-abuse, of which the Orthodox Church bans the description in order not to encourage any image of sin in the mind of the writer or the reader or listener. The Church conceives of 3 spiritual states of mankind: the supranatural, the natural, and the infra or unnatural. Virginity, monastic chastity, understood as the gifts of grace, belong to the first. To the second, the marriage which has been blessed. To the third, any other form of sexual life which will be spiritually either infranatural or against nature. The Father said, 'Attempt not the supernatural lest you fall into the unnatural.' Hence the rule never to admit anyone to monasticism without a preliminary period of trial. The monk who does not preserve his chastity ranks far lower than the man bound in a virtuous marriage, which the Church recognizes as a way of salvation. Since the monk who has pronounced vows of chastity is deprived of the right to a marriage blessed by the Church, any transgression on his part against chastity is considered a fall moreover into an unnatural state. A normal, sober marriage preserves a man's physical and moral health, whereas any other mode of sexual life, even if it only takes the form of revelry, has a disintegrating effect on the whole man, mentally and physically. This disintegrating action is particularly powerful in the monk who sins thus and so breaks vows made before God. The inner conflict engendered in him, consequent on loss of grace, assumes an incomparably more profound character, and the torments of remorse may reach the point of black despair. The imagining of sexual relations in the absence of the normal physical act has in many cases led to serious mental illness and even to total madness. Psychiatrists can testify to the frequency of such instances. 8. Acquiring chastity. St. John of Sinai dedicated step 15 of the ladder to chastity, in which he explains the practices that help us acquire it. He teaches that although ascetic efforts and avoidance are helpful, what really helps is humility, obedience, prayer, remembrance of death, and confession. To quote the Ladder of Divine Ascent, "He who fights this adversary of sensuality, of bodily hardship and sweat, is like one who has tied his foe with a string, But he who opposes him by temperance, sleeplessness, and vigil is like one who puts a yoke on him. He who opposes him by humility, freedom from irritability, and thirst is like one who has killed his enemy and has hidden him in the sand. Offer to the Lord the weakness of your nature, fully acknowledging your own powerlessness, and imperceptibly you will receive the gift of chastity. He who attempts to stop this carnal war by temperance and by that alone is like a man who has the idea of escaping the sea by swimming with one hand. Join humility to temperance, because without the former, the latter is useless. Who has conquered his body? He who has crushed his heart. And who has crushed his heart? He who has denied himself. For how can he not be crushed who has died to his own will? If you clearly know the profound weakness which is in both you and me refers to a personification of the flesh, you have bound my hands. If you starve your appetite, you have bound my feet from going further. If you take the yoke of obedience, you have thrown off my yoke. If you obtain humility, you have cut off my head. On these occasions of carnal temptation, the best aids for us are sackcloth, ashes, all-night standing, hunger, moistening the tongue in moderation when parched with thirst, dwelling among the tombs, and above all, humility of heart, and if possible, a spiritual father or a zealous brother, one spiritually mature, to help us. Footnote 785. Similarly, St. Isidore of Seville wrote in his monastic rule, quote, "He who burns with temptations of fornication should pray without ceasing, and abstain and not be ashamed to confess the heat of the lust by which he burns. Because once defeated, the vice is quickly cured, but if it lurks, it will be hidden more and more as it creeps down more deeply. In fact, he who neglects to make it known does not at all desire to cure it." And end of quote. To continue, let us by every means in our power avoid either seeing or hearing of that fruit which we have vowed not to taste. For it is absurd to think ourselves stronger than the prophet David. That is impossible. Always let the remembrance of death and the prayer of Jesus, being of single phrase, go to sleep with you and get up with you, for you will find nothing to equal these aids against carnal warfare during sleep. For those who have not yet obtained true prayer of the heart, violence and bodily prayer is a great help against carnal warfare. Stretching out the hands, beating the breast, sincere raising of the eyes to heaven, deep sighing, frequent prostrations. Raise on high the eyes of your soul if you can, but if not, your bodily eyes. Hold your arms motionless in the form of a cross, in order to shame and conquer your Amalek. By this sign, cry to him who is able to save, not with cleverly spun phrases, but in humble words. Preferably making this your prelude. Have mercy on me, for I am weak. Psalm 6:2. Then you will know by experience the power of the Most High, and with invisible help you will invisibly drive away the invisible ones. End of quote, The Ladder of Divine Ascent. Page 118 from the Holy Transfiguration Monastery Press. To continue. As an aid against carnal warfare, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain emphasized the importance of guarding our eyes. He wrote, to quote, "We must cut off seeing those beautiful bodies which incite the soul to shameful and inappropriate desires. Listen to Solomon crying out, 'Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you.' Proverbs 4:25. Listen also to Job, who said, 'I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then shall I look upon a virgin?' Job 31:1. Solomon orders us not to be ensnared by our eyes. Let not the desire of beauty overcome you, neither be enmeshed through your eyes. Proverbs 6:25. St. Gregory the Theologian, going still further, would have us avoid even a careless glance. He added this to the saying in Proverbs, 'Be not captivated by your eyes, and if at all possible, not even by a careless glance.'" Interpreting this, the commentator Nikitas Stathatos wrote the following: "Do not be captivated by your eyes" implies not only a curious and lingering look, but if possible, not even a cursory look that comes upon you by chance, thereby protecting yourselves even from a careless glance that may mislead your eyes. Because this is extremely difficult, He added the phrase, quote, if possible. What must one do when captivated by the eyes? If this thief ever comes and captivates you, fight against him and do not allow an idol of Aphrodite, that is, of any shameful desire, to be impressed upon your soul. How? Either by taking refuge in God through prayer, which is the most secure way, as the psalmist says, deliverance comes only from the Lord, or by turning your imagination to another spiritual thought, so that one imagination wipes out another, and one idol, it destroys another idol. According to the popular maxim, one peg drives out the other. This seems to be the activity that St. Gregory the theologian did when he wrote, "A face caught my attention, but was checked. I set up no image of sin. Was an image set up? Yet the experience of sin was avoided." Do you hear what he's saying? The image of sin stood before him, but was not impressed upon his imagination. Thus he was directly freed from the experience, namely from the consent or the act of sin. If then the devil does not cease to tempt you with the idol of that person that has been impressed upon your imagination, St. John Chrysostom and St. Synclitici advise you to use this method in order to be delivered from his wiles. With your mind, gouge out the eyes of that idol. Tear the flesh off its cheeks and cut off its lips. Remove the beautiful skin that is visible and meditate on how what is hidden underneath is so disgusting that no man could bear to look upon it without hatred or disgust. It is after all no more than a skull covered with skin and an odious bone filled with blood and fearful to behold. End of quote. To conclude the section and chapter, St. Isaac the Syrian taught that reading and prayer are what assist chastity. Quote, if you love chastity, banish shameful thoughts by exercising yourself in reading and prolonged prayer. Then you will be inwardly armed against their natural causes. But without reading, without prayer, purity cannot be present in the soul. End of chapter 4.